First, we need to speak with Mrs. Lynn about the possibility of a lawsuit with the author of the software program. That needs to happen first and foremost. Explaining how saving the school money is a kind act, it could potentially end up costing a lot more in the long run. Next, this conversation will also include that future behavior of this nature will not be tolerated. And while Mrs. Lynn is a valued member of the school, St. Regis really needs to follow the laws, regulations, and policies pertaining to copyright. Next, have Mrs. Lynn retrieve the copies of the software from all the teachers she distributed them to. The teachers who receive copies can be informed of the copyright infringement. I think it's best to be open and honest with educators about why things are happening in the school, and I think this could go a long way in keeping all stakeholders happy. Next is destroy all copies of the software program. The principal can double check with teachers and with Mrs. Lynn to ensure that this has happened. Fourth, we need to speak with the PTA president, Mrs. Evans, to see if another fundraiser could be held to purchase the extra copies of the software. If not, then the software can be purchased with the next year's funds. That software will probably always be there. It's best to just hold off and avoid a lawsuit at this point. This could also help smooth things over with Mrs. Evans and the PTA. Next, hold a professional development session over copyright laws, policies, and regulations. This has not happened previously, from what we can tell, and it could be beneficial to make sure it doesn't happen again in the future for the staff. Also, there needs to be an overview of what the district policies are pertaining to copyright, and if there's not any, they need to really update those district guidelines for those policies. Next, follow up with Mrs. Lynn and Mrs. Brandon individually. This could ultimately help to alleviate any negative thoughts and feelings in the situation. Talk to Mrs. Brandon and say, hey, we heard you. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. We're going to go ahead and move forward without the copying of the program. And, really talk to Mrs. Lynn after all this is over. Of course, you had that initial conversation, but following up with her is going to be key to keeping that rapport and relationship still in good relations. Lastly, the plan B, if Mrs. Lynn ultimately decides not to destroy the copies, then her being relieved of her duties might have to be considered. Obviously, this is a big thing, and I know she's trying to do really a nice gesture, but this is ultimately something that should be avoided at all cost. Next, we have the justification. How did this promote the academic success and well-being of each student and adult? My decision to destroy the copies of the computer software and keep Mrs. Lynn employed at St. Regis School ultimately was beneficial for all parties. The teachers might miss out on utilizing the software programs right now in their classrooms, but it is still promoting the well-being of everyone by doing the right thing. How we as teachers conduct ourselves and how we are lawful, it will help to mold those students the right way. How did this provide clear evidence that their pre-K through 12 students are being better prepared for college, careers, and life? If the teaching of students is being done in a lawful manner, then it's ultimately going to prepare them for life after high school. If the students are seeing us doing the right things at all times, even though they might be tough and they might be an inconvenience at times, it still needs to be done. That's how we get a better society at the end of the day. And that's how they're prepared for college, careers, and life in general after school. Next, how did it promote collaborative effort among key stakeholders? Ultimately, Mr. Sampel will be able to implement a collaborative effort among key stakeholders with his professional development session over the copyright laws, procedures, and regulations. Educators need to think about how they're using copyrighted content, and this cannot be said enough. If it feels wrong, it probably is. Making sure that they're double checking to stay within copyright regulations is really important. to help that school. It seems like everybody in that community is dedicated to making the students' lives the best they can be, and avoiding those kind of lawsuits is ultimately going to be beneficial for everyone. Supporting every student and or adult's learning and development. The students and adults would still be able to use the computer lab for the software programs. Also, this could help educators make time for specific technological resources since they have designated times within the computer lab. So instead of it just being in the classroom at all times, they can specifically have that time for technological resources. Sometimes I feel like education is going in this huge momentum shift towards technology. And while it's great, sometimes I think some of the soft skills are being lost. So taking technology out of everything might actually help those kids in the long run. But they're still getting that technological time and they're getting those lessons. Next, how do we influence student achievement by creating challenging or supportive conditions conducive to each student's learning? Mr. Sampel is achieving this by providing a computer lab for students to learn from the purchased software programs. This also promotes kinesthetic learning in a sense. Students really like moving from place to place, I've noticed. And it's still within their, with their class. So they're with familiar faces, but they're still able to go to a new place. And that's the place where technology is being taught. It's the place where that program is being used. So they're able to really kind of measure that out and making room for that kinesthetic learner, if that makes sense. A lot of the times this might even help them meet 2 out of the 3 areas. We have auditory, we have visual, we have kinesthetic. So getting up and moving to another class might not seem like a kinesthetic activity, but it actually really helps those learners getting up and just in that process. And how do we manage resources and operations of the school? Managing resources and operations within the school can only be accomplished if there's positive relationships. Mr. Sampel has done this and is able to appropriately manage St. Regis. He's managed to use the funds for student learning while avoiding situations that could ultimately end up in a lawsuit. This is really the key thing. Mismanaging resources can really hurt a school and a district. So the fact that Mr. Sampel is taking the initiative with these copyright laws is key to the success of each student and adult. Reflect on past experiences to examine, refine, and strengthen leadership platform that influences decisions, especially during difficult times. Copyright laws, regulations, policies are really important to follow in the world of education. More and more people are really looking out for them. And there's groups and holders of copyright that really monitor and enforce those rights. While we have all these new resources, some of them might be protected. In the past, I've always made sure to look at copyright violations for myself, making sure I avoid them. And ultimately, I think it comes down to using common sense. If something feels wrong, don't do it. If something seems inaccessible and you're like going through all these hoops and loops to get there, normally it should feel off. So laws vary from time to time depending on the situation, but always use your best judgment as an educator, and that's what I've always done in the past. Lastly, my reflection. This assignment significantly influenced my future as a school leader. Being able to look into a situation like this and see that all parties are really for the students, but you still have to pick, a way to go, is ultimately what a building administrator is all about. While we have the objective information and the evidence of the situation, the subjective matter is what might help the most. Everybody was working selflessly for the students in this situation, and I think that needs to be considered as a principle. Each person cares about the well-being and success of all the students. This is usually the case when it comes to laws and regulations within education. And ultimately, this has been a really interesting field to look into. Educational law has really taught me how to support my staff and students in a lawful, fair, and equitable manner. And I really appreciate what all this course has taught me. And last but very not least, references. Thank you for your time, and happy holidays.